Ladies and gentlemen, for the last 3 days, we have been covering different aspects of the Gulf Cooperation Council and in view of the changes experienced by our area. In this session, we will go back to the economic issues. I have with me 4 distinguished speakers. I start with Khalid bin Rashid al-Khater. He will be speaking about the challenges facing political and economic stability and sustainable development in the GCC countries. He used to be a visiting lecturer at Georgetown University's campus in Doha. He has previously obtained his PhD from California University. We give him 15 minutes to present his case before us, and I ask him, please, and other panelists to stick to the time limit so that we allow time for all the speakers and some time at the end for some questions and answers. I first of all like to thank the Arab Center for inviting me. And first we must agree on what is the ultimate end aim for any economic policy. Is it to secure economic stability? Is it to secure sustainable development? Or is it to maximize social welfare, or all of them together? The reason why I'm saying this is growth in rentier economies relies on exploring and producing resources and marketing them abroad, and it's very capital intensive, technology intensive, and the technology is usually imported, and it's very low in labor law, and therefore it does not mean that the vast majority cannot benefit from. We saw indications of that in Tunisia and Egypt when the World Camp and IMF were giving good indications until we suddenly woke up with a revolution. In Saudi Arabia, which produces much more than the other countries, we also have lack in sustainable development, and the other sectors of the economy are weaker, and all these factors depends on how the government distributes the wealth, and all of this in turn calls for diversification and just distribution and social justice. And I was told first I have 20 minutes, now I'm told there's 15 minutes, and 15 minutes are not enough. So I want to take 5 minutes from you and 5 minutes from the chair of this meeting. Otherwise, we will not get anywhere. One of the conditions for economic stability and accumulating capital, reforming the public system and the private sector. As for economic stability, we will talk about from the perspective of macroeconomics and reforming the system as a whole, and by that we mean the financial and other policies and exchange rates and the like to achieve economic stability. And we in the GCC countries, we use one tier of the financial policy, and that is government expenditure because there is no taxation as such. So therefore, we we call it a unilateral system. If this system was suitable for the beginning of development project and the beginning of the relations between the United States and the Gulf countries, later on we saw indications and saw how the world economy is turning into a multipolar system, and now the center of gravity is moving from the west eastwards. And in 1980, it moved from the middle of Atlantic to Turkey. And what does this mean to us? And very briefly, this means that the center of gravity in the demand for energy is shifting from the west to the east. This has weakened the historic link between the price of oil and the economic cycle in the United States, and now it's linked more to the rising economies of the East. This in turn has impacted the relations between the United States and the GCC countries because the GCC countries rely on oil, its prices, and tie their currency to the dollar. They peg it to the dollar. And with any problems the U.S. faces economically is bound to impact us. There's no time to go into detail about each slide, but you have to take what I say for granted, otherwise the chairman will have to give me more time to explain. So in brief, we say the countries would peg their currency to the dollar, and the country of the dollar itself are mutually impacted by any economic problems, and we see when there is a cycle of boom and bust, we see how most of the GCC countries expanded in their fiscal policies because they pegged their currency to the dollar, and this has impacted the stability, and the economy overheated. There was a rise in inflation, bubbles bursting in shares and real estate. Last but not least, now we see the exchange rates 2007. Now with shale gas and the lack of demand, the opposite is likely to happen. There may be a slowdown in the economy of the GCC countries, whereas U.S. economy will be growing. So therefore, the economy should always be directed towards achieving the interests of the countries themselves, GCC countries themselves, and this calls for using all the tools available in economic policy and liberate the exchange rate and turn it into a tool in the hands of the central banks rather than peg it to the dollar and with that move the fiscal policies, and this can be used, of course, as a tool in managing the macroeconomy to deal with inflation, enhance stability, combat inflation directly, and provide incentives for exports, and also will liberate the fiscal policy from the limits and conditions applied to it. And the use of all these tools together is the best recipe for a more active and effective economic policy, but reforming the economy as a whole is a necessary condition, but it's not enough. And therefore, these economies, apart from the ills, the usual ills of the rentier economies, it is also subjected to some external forces which limit its growth. For example, the shocks which impact the conditions for foreign trade when it happened in the 80s and 90s in the Gulf countries. At the same time, when there's a surplus in the supply because of the lack of the global demand or increased production, and also development in the technology of production, currencies which are pegged to the dollar, they're always subject to double instability. First, because of the volatile markets. Secondly, because they are pegged to the US dollar and suffer from any fluctuations in its rates of exchange, and not using the rate of exchange as a tool for economic policy, then we require diversification. But there are many questions, they are all there in front of you. Amongst them is how we can accumulate capital. This is a challenge facing the governments, and to what extent, how serious are they in involving the private sector in the diversification efforts? Lastly, to the growth and development of capital, and in other countries they have no problem in the number of universities or number of graduates, and they have a good base for human capital and human resources, but they do not reach the critical mass to impact the national economy, because they are mostly linked to weaker incentives, and also the accumulation of human resources or lack of empowerment. So therefore, for many reasons, whether that's because the lack of opportunities or the weakness in the role played by the private sector, or the lack of productivity in public sector, or the rentier nature of the economy, we see currently in most GCC countries all policies tend to focus on the supply and not the demand, and this is doomed to failure, because even their educational needs are measured through this phenomenon. So therefore, they should really tackle the problem at both levels, public and private sectors. Public sector in the GCC is the biggest employer of citizens, whereas the foreign workforce constitutes more than 90% or 80%, or the total workforce in the GCC countries. And employing citizens is the most common mechanism GCC governments use to redistribute the oil wealth in the rentier economy. The problem is in the GCC countries, which are high population percentages, has reached saturation levels, whereas in smaller countries lacks in number and efficiency. So if the public sector is saturated and the private sector's doors are closed in the face of the citizen, so what are we going to do with the graduates who leave universities every year? In Saudi Arabia, for example, the market needs to absorb 400,000 jobs a year, and unemployment rates in 2009 reached 30%, according to unofficial figures. But then came the revolution, the Arab Spring, and this intensified pressures on all governments, including Saudi government, and they increased their expenditure to satisfy the calls for reform and job-making opportunity. This can only lead to more saturation in the public sector, and with that will come the negative signals to the young, especially, and they will be even less interested in university education. So GCC countries try to jump forward and follow policies based on instinct and reflex and reaction rather than fundamental reform of the public and private sectors. In addition to this, the second point is to what extent can these systems manage to survive in view of the rapid increase in the number of the population, and in case the way the economy is run is kept as it is without reform. So this rigid adherence to pegging the currency to the dollar, this will make living standards more expensive, and it will lower wages and salaries and diminish any gains aimed at from increasing public expenditure. By reform, we mean reform from the top through employing efficient people, experienced people to increase productivity, and this pay should be linked to performance and incentives, etc. But if the management is weak and hesitant, this will destroy the entire organization and place a bar that no one can pass, and it will limit any future prospects of accumulating human capital, because these managers or this leadership thinks that any young comers to the scene, any fresh blood, will constitute a threat to them. Another point is the lack of diversification is also another problem faced by the private sector too. We still, the private sector uh, relies on contracts and construction and importing foreign goods and reselling them. After many years of policy based on import, there has been some accumulation of wealth and capital in the hands of very few people in society. Some of them are very closely linked to governments and elites. They manage to form their own networks of interests and wealth, and they do not allow new investors to come into the market, and they have something like monopolies in their activity. As for the development strategies, they always stress the role of the private sector, diversification, provide working opportunities, knowledge-based economy, etc. This diagram shows the relationship between the government, private sector, and the citizens. In other countries, the government excises taxes, the citizen pays the taxes, and in return gets opportunities of employment. We see here the links are this. The citizen does not elect the government. The government does not excise any taxes on the private sector, and the private sector does not provide any opportunities, whereas the consumer provides the opportunity for the private sector. So therefore, in the Arab world, the consumer always is the losing party. In a nutshell, the role of the private sector in the rentier economies of the Gulf is losing its role and becoming a heavy burden on the government. Like, for example, when a guest comes to your house, he's not satisfied with one cup of coffee. He wants a second and a third, then a piece of cheesecake, whatever. So with time, he becomes a burden. And all of this happens while the state is depleting its rentier sources of income, and in some contracts which secure huge profit margins for the private sector, but at the same time increasing the salaries and wages paid for the employees of the government. The private sector is isolated from. So, private sector does not provide investing opportunities, but it is accumulating capital away from public participation and benefiting from the returns. And the private sector does not pay any taxes to increase the treasury's income, and of course they sometimes use certain policies based on protectionist policies, and gets cheap capital, cheap labor, low skilled labor force, and importing large numbers of foreign workers, impacting societal changes a great deal, not at the same time contributing to the knowledge-based economy. And at times of booms, the private sector loses a lot of its productivity. It's very low in value adding, and they do not try to make breakthroughs. We must talk. Just give me 2 more minutes. Industrialization is important for diversification and contributes to bringing in new sources of income. Innovation also is not doing anything because of the demand and not of the supply. Development relies on the human factor, and I assure you that a human being cannot be innovative if he doesn't have any incentives. Some strategies, the strategy of the carrot and the stick, as was used in Asia. In some GCC countries, we have no such a thing. Also, we should stop failed cases of continuing, and we must focus on the activities, not on the sector as a whole. Also support research and development technology is built, it's not imported, and if imitation is ever allowed, then it should be in technology. Countries like China, Bangladesh, India, Taiwan, Chile, they did that. Also, industrialization is a successful policy. GCC countries can adopt such policies to reform the private sector, and we should try and limit the accumulation of wealth and concentration of wealth in the hands of few, and combat monopoly, increase competitiveness, widen the opportunities, and also to move from traditional means of production to new ways of thinking. So therefore, employing citizens will strengthen the economy in the long run. If we don't do that, then this sector will be threatened with the kind of policies, and at times of crisis, this sector will be the first victim, and therefore should try and look for breakthroughs in the export markets, also transparency, and this should be part and parcel of a comprehensive policy and provide opportunity for everyone and not make it a privilege for the few. Finally, there are two strategies to have a strong industrialization policy supported by a strong rate of exchange policy. And I conclude, this is a diagram which shows here. This is the curve of the bureaucrat staying in power, this axis, and on the other axis you'll see a distribution of the wealth. The more movement we make to the right, the citizens' share increases. When we move to the left, the bureaucrat or the dictator's share increases. And here, and if there is no reform, and if the oil revenues decrease, we'll have the model of Hosni Mubarak, selected few who have all the power in their hands, and the rest of the population suffers from abject poverty. This will end up in revolution if they decrease public expenditure and will apply pressure on the basic needs of people. In the other direction, development and also industrial development may need to a smooth democratization like what happened in Singapore and Spain. Thank you, Doctor. Please, your time is over. Please, you have taken a lot of time. Please, please, thank you very much.
Indeed.
35 دقيقة. I'm sorry, but we really have no time, and there are 4 papers. We really need every single minute, and I want to be fair. We thank Dr. Khater for his presentation and talked about important issues. Now we move directly to the governance of Ms. Rafika from the University of Miliana, and she lectures at the University of Miliana. She holds an MA degree from al-Bulayda University, and now she will be talking about, well, with her colleague Maymunah Ben Aichouba from the Mila University. They have a joint paper on governance and sovereign funds. 15 minutes, please.
The outset, we have listened about the identity. Actually, I would like to thank you, and in the Amazighian language, I would like to thank you as well. I'm a Muslim, and then an Arab, and then an Amazigh or a Berber. I would like to say as if لون in the Amazighi language, and hello or marhaba in Arabic. The increase of the oil has reached 150, and this had played a major role in funneling money in the coffers of the Gulf governments. And indeed, this took place because of the acquisitions and the merger of some of the banks and some of the other companies. Sorry, my paper is too long, and that's why I'm going fast. And in line of this, and in order to contribute to the stability of the financial order, to lessen the protection and to have an open environment, the sovereign funds in the GCC countries ought to commit to transparency and accountability that is adopted in the world, so that the investment decisions are depending on financial decisions rather than being political. And accordingly, thereby they will refute of having any political impetus whereby such funds can play a role within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this paper talks about the extent of commitment of such fund vis-a-vis the accountability and the transparency in order to alleviate the protectionism and the West's concerns. In accordance with such a problem, I have resorted to 3 points. First, to understand the funds. Second, the oil booms and the role thereby of the creation of the funds, and then the commitments or perhaps the requirements of the governance. I would like to talk about the sovereign wealth funds. As a matter of fact, we can define them as follows. They are new concepts. They surfaced in 2005 in Andrew Rozanov essay entitled Those Who Have the Wealth of Nations. And before that, the wealth sovereign funds term was not there. And because it is contemporary, then the definitions thereby are inaccurate, or perhaps they are not framed. And that's why I resorted to one generic definition, the IMF's definition for this investment mechanisms of the wealth funds. In terms of the characteristics of such funds, I relied on the Stephen Jones study from the Morgan study, and he had allocated 5 characters. First, the sovereignty, that means the ownership is in the hands of the government. Secondly, to deal with foreign currency. Then, the lack of debt. And the penultimate point is to have a capacity for risk management, and then to have a long-term prospect of investment. When it comes to the sovereign funds, there are 5: the stability, the development, and the reserve, emergency, retirement funds. And this table talks about the characteristics of every single part of it. I would like to talk now about the oil boom and the role thereby. in the creation of the sovereign wealth funds. As you know, the world has went through three oil booms. The first and the second was accompanied with the mechanism of the petrodollar, and then it took place in the third boom. We had got acquainted with the wealth sovereign funds, whereby the investment part plays a major role. When it comes to the first fund, it took place long time ago, before the first oil boom. It was a Kuwaiti fund in 1953. As for the spread of the sovereign wealth funds, it took place in the last decade, whereby 24 of funds surfaced in 2007, and now the number is 75 in accordance with the latest studies. 75 wealth, sovereign wealth funds across the world, in accordance with the concept of the IMF. When it comes to the reality of these funds in the GCC countries, this table illustrates the ranking when it comes to the assets, the resources, whether they were oil or others. Most of the sovereign wealth funds, as I said, there are 14 in the Gulf states, and the total assets amount to 37% of the total funds of the world. It is very clear that the sovereign wealth funds in the GCC countries has been there for a long time in comparison with the world's. If we think of the third oil boom, if we look at the table, we can see that there are 9 out of 14 funds took place in 2002 until now. That means they are accompanied with the third oil boom. The Arab sovereign funds are pioneering. They are at the forefront because they are ranked first when it comes to the size of the assets, and they are commodity based. That means they are gas based or oil based sovereign wealth funds. When it comes to the governance of these funds, the funds of the GCC countries in 2007 and until the 2008, and the acquisition thereby of a number of assets in Europe and the United States of America, a debate has flared in terms of their role on the international arena, and that necessitated a number of practices that clarify what takes place inside the funds and support the mechanisms. When it comes to the concerns of the international or the Western concerns, and especially the US concerns, relates to two reasons, political ones and economic ones. When it comes to the political concerns, we can summarize it in one point. They can resemble a tool in the Arab-Israeli conflict. When it comes to the economic concern, it might become a vehicle for an economic pressure. For example, having strategic manufacturing capabilities in the strategic countries. In order to lay off the protectionism and to alleviate the pressures on the governments, some steps were taken in the Gulf in order to make sure that they reap the benefit. There are certain measures whereby the international organization like the IMF has advised, and also the OECD and the other institutions like the Peterson Institution for the International Economy, and there are certain objectives for such standards whereby these wealthy funds can be incorporated within the global economy. I would like to talk about the IMF's efforts here. They can be summarized in the Santiago Principles in 2008, and they are 24. And this table talks about the Santiago Principles. It is very clear from this table that the Arab countries or the sovereign wealth funds in the GCC countries are still far away from the mean level of compliance to the principles, i.e. 70%. And for example, in Abu Dhabi, 53%, Kuwait 52%, and Qatar 31%, and Bahrain 24%. These are the percentage of compliance. Albeit that Qatar, when it comes to the compliance, is retreating and it is not advancing. They are -4, but Bahrain, they are advancing in the respect of the Santiago Principles because they have advanced by 11%. In terms of the OECD, the initiative of the OECD, it is the most comprehensive political international initiative. It aims at developing a political approach that is more coherent for the members in order to understand these funds and aim at emphasizing their compliance to the investment policies, the open one, and it was complemented by having in October 2008. When it comes to the efforts of the Institute of the Sovereign Wealth Funds, they can be depended on by looking at the LINAPO index model for transparency. That means every index means +1 or 1 out of 10 grades, and these indexes can be used in another ranking. We have sovereign wealth funds that are transparent and others that are of low transparency. So any sovereign wealth fund that has 8 out of 10, it is transparency, and less than 8, it will be considered not transparent. This table will illustrate the outcome of Lina Board Madwell's index from 2010 up until 2014. We can notice that the United Arab Emirates Fund has obtained 10 out of 10. Abu Dhabi is 4 out of 10. Al-Bahrain 8 out of 10. And Qatar is 5 out of 10. They are not transparent in accordance with such index. And lastly, last but not least, I would like to allude to the Edwin Truman Index from the Peterson Institute. He deals with the governance, the structure, the accountability and transparency, and the conduct. 4 reports were drafted up to this moment in accordance with such index. The outcomes of this index since 2007 are illustrated in this slide. Qatar's authority and the Abu Dhabi Wealth Fund as well, and also the holding company in Bahrain are a bit far from being compliant. What I mean by compliance here is to comply to the transparency and accountability standards. After presenting the indexes that measure the accountability and transparency, we can indeed say that the sovereign wealth funds in the GCC countries are still far away from acceptable levels of exposure and accountability transparency. We can notice that the Lina board, Bahrain, is the most transparent, but when it comes to the other principles of Santiago, it is the least transparent. And this emblematic of the changes of the indexes and the sovereign wealth fund, the Bahraini one, it is embryonic and it has no capability of complying to the Santiago principles. I'll go back to this point. By and large, we can say that they are not transparent, but the problem of transparency, especially after the crisis, has propelled the changes. The changes are prerequisites, internationally speaking, despite the fact that there are no levels that are up to the standards of transparency, are not advancing on this front. The liquidity that the wealth funds have provided for the West and the other companies in the West played a major role, and it was put under the limelight, especially when it comes to the solidification of the economy. Indeed, they funneled money in the American banks and in Europe. So the transparency issues are not there, people are not talking about it anymore. But if these funds are transparent, then the phenomenon will be more healthy. So the future of the sovereign wealth funds is related to its capability of exposure and to have strategies that are crystal clear, because this will contribute in its capacity to continue investing in the world and to dispense with the local and the international concerns, whereby the revenues of the oil might resemble a quantum leap, and in order to avoid the concerns vis-a-vis such quantum leap, the sovereign wealth funds ought to be transparent and the gentleman is saying the time is up. You've got 2 sentences and that's it. 2 short sentences. And your time will be up. So the transparency, as a matter of fact, is not a demand on the part of the Western societies now, but for the sovereign wealth funds, they need to resort to transparency and to understand the points of transparency in order to avoid any concerns, any new concerns in the future. And thank you very much indeed, and sorry for taking much of your time. Thank you, Dr. Rafika and Dr. Maymunah, for this paper. I am indeed embarrassed because of the time constraints, and I know that such studies depend on indexes and it depends on studies, and it needs more time. So I'd like to apologize again, and I know the time is up, but we'll move to Mr. Slimane Zouari Ferhat. He will be talking about the Gulf sovereign wealth funds between the requirements of investment receiving states and opportunities. He studies at Awad University. He's from Algeria. He's got a master's degree from Algeria, and he's preparing to have a PhD from the same university. 15 minutes, please. And if there were 10, I'll give you an award or a prize. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, I would like to thank first sincerely the Arab Center for research and policy studies, and those who organized such a gathering, and for providing this opportunity to tackle part of this conference. I would like also to thank the teachers and indeed Mr. Karim Slimani. As a matter of fact, I'll just want to kick off. I'll be talking about the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states, the requirements of investments and the receiving states, and opportunities for income diversification. The lady has talked in theory about these funds, so we'll supersede such points and we can notice that there is a problem and there is a challenge for such funds in the Gulf because of the demands of the Western markets vis-à-vis investments in their markets. And this study has touched upon the alternatives or the solutions to surmount such challenges. The problem of this study lies in the alternatives, the choices that we might resort to in order to surmount the challenges of the investment in the West and in the USA. So that's why we have resorted to 3 points that we can consider as hypotheses. The demands of the recipient countries resemble an impetus to the GCC countries to look for alternatives. There are initiatives from these wealth funds to meet the demands of the recipients states. The other point is to do with emphasizing these funds in order to diversify their portfolio, and that's why we have resorted to 4 axes. The first one is to do with the reality of these funds, the objectives. The second one talks about the investments of these funds, and we focus on the positive aspects of those who hold these funds and the recipient countries, as well as the requirements of the recipient countries, whereby they resemble some legislations and acts, especially in the West. And the last point, we had in place some alternatives and some solutions for the Gulf countries in order to meet such demands and adapt themselves to the changes. Here, as we understood, the lady has talked about the Abu Dhabi Authority, for example. It has 773 billion. In Saudi Sama, they have 773 billions as well. And the first one, Kia, in Kuwait, it amounts to 410 billion dollars. And there are some American sovereign funds that were incorporated in our talk, and they preceded the Kuwaiti one. But here we talked about the numbers. Our colleague talked about the boom in these funds in the last decade, especially in the Gulf, and the reason was to do with the third oil boom. And this is the bottom line here. In the 90s, there was no sovereign wealth funds. But if we compare this to the Norwegian wealth fund, the Norwegian wealth fund felt that indeed there is a need for establishing such a fund. Here, the graph illustrates the number of wealth funds from 2007 until 2014. We noticed that the global assets resemble $3.3 trillion, and in this year it jumped to $6.6 trillion. From 2007 to 2013, the mean average of this growth amounted to 11% annually. That means this is a positive development, and the funds play a major role in the global economy. In accordance with some of the statistics, the Gulf funds resemble 1/4 of the total. That means 1.4 trillion in 2012, 27% of the total. In 2013, it jumped to 2 trillion. That means 33% of the total. And this year, 2.4 trillion, that means 36 or approximately 37% of the global fund. When it comes to the strategy, these funds look for long-term investments, especially abroad, because of the lack of the capacity of the Gulf economy. And that's why they looked for extra opportunities in the West. 66% of the investments of the funds 2000 to 2008 lie in the OECD. That means the European countries mainly. The other part are invested in the BRICS countries. That means that these BRICS countries are, albeit they are emerging, but they are a good destination to invest in. When it comes to the sectors, the focus was in the financial sector, 35%, then the real estate sector, and then the energy, the utilities, and then the industries or the manufacturing sector. I don't want to dwell indeed on the investments, but this table shows the percentage of the investment of such funds. It might resemble 10% of the assets of the corporates, but we'd like to move to the third point that deals with the issue of the demands or perhaps the challenges of such funds. We said that the developed countries has the lion's share of these investments, albeit they are the countries that look at these matters doubtfully, especially the US and the EU. And there are other deals and sectors, but when it comes to the standards of such work, these standards are kind of superficial requirements, but later on we'll be talking about the subtle requirements. Any country has the right to protect its own economy. The second point is to do with the policy of the investments abroad. Does it have to be commercial per se, or can we talk about the decision-making process? Does it, or has it been affected by such investments? Will it be possible for the investment clarity and transparency to be taken heed of, and other issues that relate to such deeds? Sometimes in America it takes 37 days for an investment to be agreed upon. The EU, for example, also through Germany had passed legislation in February 2009. They put a cap on the assets of these funds. 25% is the cap, and in the USA it is 10%. The cap on investments, and France has a different stance. It is a bit open because the Qatar invests heavily in France, and you can notice that the percentage is 33.33%. That's the cap on the investment, but there are some restrictions, and it had enacted certain laws. When it comes to the UK is also open, but it had legislations in place, and especially the Kia and the British Petroleum, whereby 20% was the cap. It has been decreased to 9.9 by an act through the Parliament. But Britain is a very important destination for the sovereign wealth funds, because it has these wealth funds have their headquarters in Britain. When it comes to Australia, also they followed suit in this matter, and they had certain restrictions. We can summarize and say that for the funds, they have been allowed indeed to participate in the investments abroad, but to a certain extent, in certain sectors whereby the officials that deal with investments identify and the lengthy period of the procedures whereby some time might be wasted, and the expansion of the concept of the national security in the USA and the EU, which makes these countries have their own justifications, even if the deal is there and the applicable procedures that are amended every time. It gives the impression that there are preferential treatments. First, to have a preferential treatments that differentiates between the private and the public, the developed and the developing countries, whether it is a democratic government or not. The third and the fourth point is to do with the alternatives and the solutions. The GCC countries ought to invest these assets locally in the local market, especially when we are witnessing mega projects in the infrastructure in the region. In 2011, we had only 33% of this investment. It jumped into 56% in 2012, whereby such surpluses can be invested here indeed, because we reap benefits indeed locally. The second point is to have different alternative markets as destinations. We had a study that compares the GDPs. We thought that the BRICS, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and so, as you know, the GDP is huge. This will allow us to invest in such markets, and these markets indeed have an environment conducive to empowering such investments. Latin America and Eastern Europe as well has environment that is conducive indeed, and why not invest in the Arab world as well, especially when there are plenty of mega projects. As I said, this might resemble an alternative solution for these funds. Also, I talked about the diversification of the portfolio. 50% of them are stocks. But when we came to the sectors, we thought that we ought to target the sectorial kind of homes, and that's why we need to have this percentage by 50% and to focus on the diversification of the I think 20% for the bonds, or investment in the bonds is huge indeed, because this will lead to the lack of the revenues in comparison with the inflation. When it comes to the other alternatives, my colleague has talked extensively about these matters, especially when it comes to the Santiago principles. In 2013, this compliance index has talked about percentages. Above 80% is excellent, and average is below 50 up to 30. And as you see from this chart, the Kuwaiti fund and the Abu Dhabi authority indeed jumped from second to third, and Bahrain was at the low level as well. There's also the other Linabo Motherwell index for transparency. Most of the Arab funds are retreating indeed, because the governance of such funds ought to be reactivated and ought to be taken into consideration, governance, transparency and accountability, because there's a demand from the Western societies as well as the local. As in summary, indeed, the assets of these funds are huge because of the oil boom. Adopting this choice to pull the string of the oil boom has been commendable. There are also some demands from the recipient countries. BRICS, for example, is more compatible nowadays because it has environment that is conducive of good investments. They are emerging countries, and their growth has become has increased indeed. When it comes to the other blocks, we cannot dispense with them, especially the USA and the EU. They have indeed plenty of corporates, and we can derive benefits and experiences, and perhaps have also to attract some industries as Mubadala in Abu Dhabi did. There's also the indexes that we need to take heed of, and the recipients, for example, are compelled to change their positions. But when it comes to the governance of the funds, there is if they agree with the transparency and the accountability, then they can lay off the concerns of the West. And indeed, the last point is to do with the applicable procedures in the USA and the EU to justify the national security, and this is exaggerated indeed. It has been expanded and it is loose, and that's why the funds in the is sometimes reticent in having further deals in the EU and the USA. This ought to be taken into consideration, especially when we are focusing on the crisis that is going on, and the recovery is not still there. We have to emphasize the cooperation between the GCC countries to have perhaps a joint sovereign wealthy fund to emphasize the propagation of the other funds in the global market. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Farhat. My heart goes out to the translators because the speakers are going very, very fast. Now we have our last speaker, Dr. Awad, who holds a PhD degrees from Cairo University. And she used to be advisor at the Council of Ministers. Now she works for Tanmiya, which focuses on small and medium size. Um, and I begged her to use all her skills to summarize, and so that we can finish on time and have some time for questions and answers. In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate. I think it seems that the last presentation comes in extra time. I'll try to focus on the main themes, and the details I leave it to you to read in the paper itself. Even the technology is not on my side, it seems. The title of the paper is to diversify the sources of income in the short and long term. Countries in general have a problem when it comes to sustainable economic growth, and GCC countries are not exception. This is, of course, linked to other factors like diversification, good governance, and other factors. So therefore, countries recognize the importance of economic diversification and the reliance on the private sector. The problem is the indicators do not show any positive leaps as such, and they do not show what kind of diversification is more desirable than others. We have an index of the governance of good governance on the sources of income for countries. It involves 58 countries, only three of which are from the GCC countries. Bahrain comes at, I think, number 33 or something, and it is scored very weakly indeed. Saudi Arabia failed the test, so this means that there are two problems. Despite countries adopting strategies aimed at diversification, the desired effect has not been achieved. GCC countries suffer from common problems like reliance of the hydrocarbons and the high cost of labor, imported labor, and reliance on foreign labor, especially in the private sector. According to the latest report on the World Economic Reform, it was noticed that 80% created by the private sector in GCC countries were occupied by foreign workers, and also um, productivity or the lack of it actually increases. So we have obstacles to sustainable development. These are amongst the way this phenomenon impacts the economy. The paper focuses on three themes. First of all, economic development cannot happen randomly, but it takes a long period of time, exerting multidimensional efforts, using strategic vision in managing the economy, and this is not actively noticeable in the GCC countries. The problem this study wants to deal with is what can be done in the future by the GCC countries, which will help these countries to achieve high rates of growth and sustainable growth in the economy. We want to mention the desired economic diversification. Secondly, suggest a module for strategic thinking and for the desired diversification. There are four dimensions to this in the paper. First of all, diversifying experts rather than relying on a small number of commodities. Secondly, diversify the products horizontally in the hydrocarbon sector and to add more layers of production to involve sectors outside the hydrocarbon sector itself. The third dimension, and that is the private sector playing a leading role and contextualizing that through small and medium-sized companies and projects. Number four, we must have a different system of recruitment and not rely heavily on the foreign workforce and rectify the defects in the labor market, not only in the public sector but and in the private sector too, because there is also disparity in the male to female number of labor force and so on and so forth. The features of the desired economic diversification, there are six main features. First of all, involve other sectors outside the oil and gas, diversify through producing the kind of products that satisfy the needs of export markets, not just the regional and local ones. Also, the government should make sure that the public and private sector cooperation is done at optimum level. Also, enabling the small and medium-sized projects to play a fundamental role. Also, to have a just system of distribution of wealth. The model we are suggesting here is to focus on medium and long-term vision. This requires strategic thinking and plans. and following the methodology of the World Bank, and we find or we set a model for the desired model, and then we start setting our plans, and we follow them up, and we measure the success. As for according to the World Bank, to set the desired model should take into account the long-term effects and the return in the medium rate and the short range too. Of course, here we are dealing with economic diversification as a main drive for development, and not just any development but a sustainable one, according to one of the studies by the Arab Center. And with that definition, I say the countries achieving growth rates for 75 years at least, and fundamental changes in the level of competitiveness. As for the short and medium term, I don't think I have time to go through them. The main drive, according to this model, is to develop the private sector, through having a private sector which is able to lead the efforts towards development with a kind of recruitment regime which relies on national local talents. And of course, knowledge-based economy relying on innovation is another condition, and the incentives here will be the competence of the government bodies to impact this process. When there is agreement on the model, then we find a number of interventions by way of programs or projects to achieve the results. As for the measures, to performance measures, it's not enough just to talk about the value of this diversification in the past, but we should have some reference points, some measurements. These are the 6 different visions for the 6 countries making up the GCC. We will find that the results of that, for example, the average of economic growth has fluctuated, and it was not linked to the Human Development Index. Also, we will find that projections for economic growth in the future is also can fluctuate, and it will be less than 7%. So therefore, this is not the right track either. Also, in the labor market, and the number of jobs created in the private sector, we will see that a large number of them was for the citizens only, and we notice a high percentage of unemployment again amongst the youth. And also we still have the oil and gas sector predominantly controlling the export market. And also with the current decrease in the price of oil, and this should be included in the risk assessment for the GCC, of course, and despite the fact that reasonable levels of competitiveness have been achieved according to the international standards, we still have elements in the GCC indicating that the GCC countries have scored very low percentages indeed. As for the desired trends, we base that on four dimensions like economic development, economic diversification through focusing on certain aspects without taking into account the technology transfer. And as for developing the private sector, there should be developing clear strategies for the small and medium-sized companies and spread a culture of understanding the importance of entrepreneurship, innovation, and also the competence on behalf of the government agency. This is an important factor in running the final conclusion is a suggestion that GCC countries should employ a complete system to assess economic diversification, which relies on the internationally known standards to see how they're doing. This will be through a series of debates, resulting in the end a strategy which can be applied regionally based on a proper assessment of the present situation and come up with action plans and measurement tools. Thank you. You won. Thank you, Dr. Rasha, for this valuable paper. I think we should move immediately to the questions. Officially, the session is over. We started 7 minutes late. I think we have something like 10 minutes. Okay. Okay. We have three questions first and see how we do with time. Please introduce yourself and do not take more than 1 minute, please. Yusuf Al-Haddad from Georgetown University, Georgetown. A question to Mr. al-Khater. What are the steps you want to take to overcome the problems overheating in the economy, especially in the construction sector? Secondly, for diversification and the private sector in Qatar, don't you agree that for the Qatari citizen there are no incentives to attract him to have some sort of personal initiative? The benefits are there, the salaries are there, but they do not seem to be entrepreneurial in their thinking. Jassim Hussein from Bahrain. I'm an economist. I have a question to Dr. Khalid al-Khater. He focused on industrialization. I asked him, can or do Gulf countries have a real competitive ability in industrialization? Our colleague from Algeria, you talked about Qatar's investments in London. Can you assess Qatar's investment in buying Harrods in London? Was that a sound investment decision? Nasser Sana from Kuwait. And these papers are very enjoyable, and I thank the chair to give them time. But I think these are important documents. I hope we can have a look at them. my question is, how can we transform whether the indexes or suggesting on diversification or the suggestion of establishing an entity which can assess our ability this regard. What is the mechanism our panelists suggest which can turn their papers from mere papers for discussion to mechanisms that can put before the decision makers and help our countries and like for example transparency organization publishes its data on corruption. I think last week they published the latest one, but this figure when when there are local NGOs which are branches of the international organized transparency organization, they push the politicians to change the position of the country and do better. When it comes to sovereign funds, although the sums of money are larger, but my question is how can we turn these papers into tools of pressure on politicians and decision makers? Thank you, our colleagues, panelists. I have one question and a very short comment. Russia said that part of economic diversification is to limit the reliance on foreign labor. The big challenge here is difficulty in replacing foreign workers with local workers. The problem is well known to everybody, and because Gulf societies find it difficult for cultural reasons to engage in the kind of jobs like foreign workers do. For example, in Saudi Arabia, unemployment rate is very high. It's not always due to the lack of working opportunities, but people decline working in certain jobs. That's why they bring in workers from abroad. So if we want to reduce our reliance on foreigners, and there is difficulty in solving that. So what is the alternative? The other question I posed to Ms. Rafika and Mr. Sulaiman, if the sovereign funds focus on investment in sectors other than oil and gas outside the Gulf countries and they bear all the limits and conditions placed by the countries. Why don't they bring their investments into their own country? Yes, I understand the diversification aspect, but in the UAE haven't done badly. In Bahrain, it's also clear because the oil sector's participation is small anyway in comparison. So the problem is exasperating. In Kuwait, we still, the oil sector constitutes a large percentage of the national GDP, and this means failure in diversification efforts at the economic level. By and large, there may have been small successes here and there, but they have not been widely recognized or accepted. Thank you. Thank you. Is there any more? Are there any more questions, Mr. Qaddoumi?
Hi. Sorry, my question is going to be in English. This is for Dr. Khalid and Dr. Rasha. Both of you mentioned the knowledge economy in your talks, and this was in another panel, I believe it was yesterday. What is the knowledge economy specifically in Qatar as compared to GCC countries and compared to, if you look at a development plan in Turkey or even in a country like South Africa, this is the same term that we use. How are our strategies different here versus these other countries in a very kind of specific way? Is it, I guess my fear is that we tend to focus on consumption a lot when we speak about knowledge economy. So how do we be very specific about forging a strategy in that regard?
We'll move to the panelists. Dr. Khalid, please. You can take as much time as you want. In terms of the question regarding the remedy or the treatment, when it comes to the demand bottlenecks or perhaps expanding the capacity in the industries and in the factories of constructions and so on and so forth, and the storage. When it comes to the policies, I think that the monetary or the financial policy, the government obviously commits itself to certain expenditure programs that relates to diversification and Vision 2030, and there are some international obligations. When it comes to the monetary fund or the monetary policy, it relates to the foreign exchange, and then you can resort to the liquidity and the central bank link. When it comes to the second question, whereby the Qataris are facing what we call the scourge of resources. The solutions are difficult. We need to have reforms in the public sector and the private sector. The public sector, we need to make it more productive. It ought to resort to governance, as well as the private sector through deconstruction of some of the structures, and to have to create jobs. The private sector depends on the rentier components, so I'm afraid to say that the solution is to do with separating the rentier components with the civil service, because civil servants can have jobs and they can work in the public sector and waste time and chat with others, and other people can work day and night and receive the same salary. We need to separate these issues. Or perhaps those who don't work, they might indeed be promoted, and these are the negative aspects of the rentier economy. I need perhaps to give the locals a minimum, but 6,000 riyals, for example. This is your share of the distribution of wealth, or perhaps what we call a rentier allowance. They can do whatever they want, but if he wants or she wants more than 6,000, then he or she needs to be productive. I had an idea, those countries who depend on the rentier economy in Alaska, or there are other three countries. There's one state in Canada and Norway as well. cash is distributed to the populace. The problem of the rentier economy that we hear again and again, it is to do with distribution. On what basis we can distribute the wealth? Because the production might depend on one company or two companies with high tech from abroad, and a few staff they can produce and sell. When it comes to the competitive advantage, as if you're saying that you can't compete at all. I say that the 1,000 miles journey start with 1 mile with the first step. So we need to do something. We need to put our foot in the door, and we need to depend on our capabilities. This boom of productivity cannot be sustainable for the future generations. So if the Gulf countries are convinced, then they need to be competitive. But if we say we can't do this and that, then we'll be stopping where we are. Thank you. The last lady, I haven't heard her properly, so I do apologize. I'll ask the question. I'd like to apologize for the translator because of the rhythm of. I will not apologize for you because that's me. As a matter of fact, when it comes to selling commodities, when it comes to the funds, the sovereign wealth funds, when it comes to investments, it looks for the profit rather than the type of investments. So it looks for increasing the margin, even if it invests in the sports, for example. When it comes to the mechanism that might be floated in order to provide these studies for the populace, there were plenty of studies and reports about the transparency of the foreign or the wealth funds, and they indicated that they are not up to the standards when it comes to transparency, especially when is the compliance to such transparency is not a demand, it is a necessity in order for them to involve in the future global economy and to face any challenge that relates to protectionism in the future. When it comes to the investments of the sovereign wealth funds abroad, why don't they invest in the GCC countries? That was a question. I think that there is a problem in the oil dependence countries that is to do with the capacity. Save Algeria and Iraq. I think that the GCC countries as a whole, they do not have the capacity to accommodate all these surpluses. That's why it is necessary for it to reach out abroad. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Nasser Saleh asked about the optimal mechanism. I think my colleague answered this question. When it comes to the second question of Mr. Nasser Saleh, what is the mechanism? We need to agree upon one thing. If we have surpluses in the GCC countries because of these revenues in these countries, we need to agree when the British and the US joined their efforts to launch the IMF, and here we can follow suit, and we can, for example, have a certain joint project. We used to call it the Generations Fund, we used to call it the oil funds, now it's called the Sovereign Wealth Funds. Regardless of the names, they resemble a mechanism, but the problem lies in the governance of such wealth funds, because the governance of these funds relate to the public as well as the private sector. The transparency of the information is a necessity. The crisis has proved that there are misinformation when it comes to reporting on such matters. Here and in the future, the sovereign wealth Gulf funds ought to emphasize their governance. They ought to do that locally and internationally, because the international investment needs to understand the solvency of these wealth funds. They are very, when it comes to Norway, for example, we can see that if you go to the Norwegian bank, you would understand the assets, and this changes from time to time. When it comes to the Arab funds, they lack certain information, and as a matter of fact, there are some standards when it comes to certain indexes. There are what we call the hedge funds, and they sometimes have certain projections. Sometimes they indeed do not divulge any information. If you divulge information, then we will reach the level of transparency that will help the countries where these funds are. The gentleman has talked about diversification of the economy. We need to have institutions, and we need to have the studies in place, and how such institutions play a role. The economists will have the plan in place, and even if the decision makers did not take heed of it, but when they have the will, then they can have a plan in place, a study in place, a research in place. The other point, the gentleman Muhammad talked about the lack of capacity, or the weakness of the capacity. We said that there are mega projects. There's a huge city that's been built in Riyadh. So these funds ought to focus their investments on the infrastructure, especially for the benefit of the local economy. There are also some rooms in Algeria, for example, in the energy sector, and the lady said, why not focus on Sudan in the agriculture sector? So this will lead first to emphasizing the integration between the Arab worlds. And why don't we have why have we got the surpluses pouring abroad, and rather than investing them here in the real genuine sectors to provide genuine diversification and genuine economy, even if the margin is not up to the standards? This will create jobs and will meet the objectives of the future. When it comes to the other point, we had precedents, and we need to follow suit some of the examples. If we have a crisis, a global crisis, and we need liquidity, and as we know, some of the Western leaders came to the Gulf asking for investments. Why don't we use our tools to pressurize the other countries, and perhaps have some gains to invest in the strategic sectors, for example, in order to bring the technology to our countries, for example? There's only one point, or perhaps I apologize for taking much of your time, but yes, we've talked about the funds and the West, and we said that there is a Gulf Summit. Why don't we have a joint wealth fund to face the challenges? Because we know it takes two to tango, and even if Abu Dhabi Authority
played a role in this country or that? Why not the efforts? Why can't we have concerted efforts in certain sectors? Thank you. Thank you for posing the questions. They are good questions. They relate to each other. Even the proposed model is very, when it comes to the incentives of the locals to become entrepreneurs, I think we need to bridge the gap in the labor market for the locals not to resort to the public sector but go to the private sector. We need incentives. We need for the nationals to polish their skills in order to have a balance between the demand and the supply. They need to have also information that relate to the construction, for example, whereby some avert from certain jobs. The culture is different, and the Dutch disease cannot go along. We need to have institutions to provide services for the entrepreneurs and also to develop the environment to keep the pace with the small investors or small entrepreneurs. We cannot have, for example, a project in place and at the same time when the project cracks on, those in charge cannot have government's guarantees or fundings and so on and so forth, and then the project will fall flat. When it comes to the curbing the migrant workers, I think part of it is to do with entrepreneurship and the development of the private sector's activities. And we need to have to raise the awareness amongst the populace. When it comes to the knowledge-based economy, there is an index called the complexity degree of the economic activity. It deals with the depth of the functions and it relies on 122 countries. We can see that the United Arab Emirates is ranked 62nd, the KSA 64th, Qatar 78th, and Kuwait is ranked 102nd. This shows that the economy is indeed based on knowledge. Relatively speaking, in our countries, they are quasi kind of knowledge-based economy. They lack the skills to get a full-fledged knowledge-based economy. The last question is how to transform the indexes for them to be available for the decision makers. There is the General Secretary of the GCC countries. It has adopted a project to diversify the economy in these countries. First, we need to confess and say that we are remiss when it comes to the diversification. We talk about the diversifications and the sectorial strategies and the holistic strategies, but these strategies are not still up to the standards so that the decision maker can depend on. And that's why if you want to follow the strategies, we need to have A, B, C, D, E. We need to assess and know what do I need. That means to have a gap analysis, to have these components. The paper has talked about some ideas, but it needs some detail. The B is the baseline, to have in place the indexes to measure the impact of the outcomes in the logic model. The D is to understand the components and the projects, the programs on the level of every single country in the GCC, and then down to specifics. That means to apply and implement these methods and evaluate it through a follow-up mechanism. Some countries have their own ministries to follow up to have a mechanism in order to assess and follow up the diversification of the knowledge, the economy, and consequently the countries might adopt to have further systems and mechanisms to follow up the general performance of all the strategies. The outcomes, if the outcomes were put on the shelf or if they were scattered on a par with other indexes, then things would become a failure. But if we take heed of them and analyze them, then we will reach the.
Thank you very much for all of you for these presentations. Now we want Mr. Marwan Qablani, who will deliver the closing remarks of this conference. Now that we've come to the closing moments of this conference, we would like to thank all the presenters, the participants, all of you who posed questions and commented. This was an opportunity to bring together a large number of experts from the Gulf area. Shortly before this conference, I listened to some colleagues talking about the possibility of getting some research papers, and now we see many papers have been presented, and there is also diversity in opinion over them, but nonetheless we really are to blame. I learned more about Saudi Arabia from English sources than any Arabic sources. Of course, I'm not saying others should not research into our situations. On the contrary, but we too have to shoulder our own responsibility to present our causes, cases, problems, call it what you like, not through the eyes of people who sit in London, Paris, or New York, but from the perspective of people living in this part of the world. For this reason, the center has invited this distinguished group of experts, but this is not the only thing we do. Our doors are open to your research also, not just the panelists here in this conference. We will collect the papers and publish them, but also we invite you to send to us any papers you have regarding Gulf countries, their problems, their societies, their ambitions. I once again thank you all for taking the time and trouble and joining us in this event, and look forward to meeting you in future events. Thank you.